today, we're going to have to really dig in. We've got a whole chapter. If you were wondering if you were going to get some Bible today, I promise you're going to get like a whole chapter of Bible. And the way we're going to start out is just thinking about what you believe in, what's important to you, what gives you your life meaning. Now, we're in church, so you kind of have to say God and those right answers first. And so, okay, we all know that part. But think about the other things that you're involved in, that you're involved in it because it means something. It's important. It's like, it's a cause. It's bigger than you are. And you feel really good being a part of it. Because the truth is, everybody seeks God in one form or another. Even people who say like they're spiritual, even people who say that they're not spiritual, like they don't really believe in anything spiritual at all. They still believe in something. Have some of you seen those commercials coming on recently about soccer? Anybody? Well, okay, I must watch a different TV. But anyway, I've been seeing these soccer commercials, and it's all very like, wow, it's very spiritual because they're calling it a religion, a world religion, that all these different nations can be involved in. They're all different, but they all can believe in this one same thing together and play the game together and forget their differences while they play the game. And it means a lot to them. Maybe the whole year leads up to whatever special soccer day there is. I'm familiar with the special football days, but not so much with the special soccer days. But you hear what I'm saying? In fact, this commercial calls it a religion. And in a way, it is. So everybody believes in something, one way or the other. And it really wasn't any different in the ancient times. In fact, it was the norm for your culture or your nation to have several gods, which was, if you think about it, kind of fun because you could pick your favorite and that god would be on your side. And the Egyptians, in fact, they were pretty much overachievers, so they had 80 gods. They wanted to cover all the bases. I tried to find a picture of all 80 and it just took too long. So just pretend in your mind you can see 80 different gods. Now, Egypt's gods focused on 3 different regions. The first region was the Nile. Okay, that was a no-brainer. The next one was the fertile earth, because that's where their food and everything came from. And I think they recognized that even they were of the earth. And then their last region was the sky, which included the sun and everything that's in the sky. And so what we're going to see as we go through these plagues is that God seemed to prepare 3 arenas of contest with the gods of Egypt. And each contest or cycle dealt with one of these regions, the Nile, the fertile earth, and the sky. Each of these contests involved 3 plagues. And you're way ahead of me. You're like, but there's 10 plagues. Okay, but there was a special one. That wasn't part of the contest. That was a judgment plague. But the first 9, they fit into 3 cycles. And after the end of this talk time today, I think we're going to have enough information, enough data to see the pattern in these 3 cycles. It's going to emerge and show us sort of a progressive revelation that God used as he presented himself to the Egyptian people. So just as a reminder, what we've gone through already, we've gone through the Nile plague. So the blood, that was a big one. Frogs, you remember that one. The swarms of gnats, and that ended the first cycle, showing God's dominion over all the Nile gods, not just one, but all, but one represented. All right, the 4th plague that we did last week, that was the biting flies. That began the 2nd cycle, dealing with the earth gods. So we're going to pick it up today with the 2nd plague in that cycle, dealing with the earth gods. So let's see what we have. I'm going to just read it to you. I know you can read it too, but there's some things that I want you to pay attention to. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, so that they may worship me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, the hand of the Lord will strike with a deadly pestilence your livestock in the field, the horses, donkeys, camels, herds, flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing shall die of all that belongs to the Israelites.' And the Lord set a time, saying, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land.' And on the next day the Lord did so. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, But of the livestock of the Israelites, not one died. Pharaoh inquired and found out that not one of the livestock of the Israelites was dead. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he would not let the people go. So here's what I want you to notice. First thing, God himself sent the pestilence. He said he'd do it, and he did it. Nobody waved a staff or said anything. It was all God, just like he did with the flies last week. Moses and Aaron not involved. Evidently, Pharaoh sent some envoys into Goshen to kind of tell him, well, okay, did the Hebrew livestock die? And the envoys came back, said no, they were spared. So God had made his point. He'd made a distinction. Your cattle are dead, my people's cattle live. And that was a direct hit on the cows of Hathor, or Hathor, Egyptian goddess of love and protection. Well, she wasn't able to protect her own cows, so God had made his point. Runners-up were Apis, which is a sacred bull, Ta, the calf god Ra. There was a bunch of other ones. You remember there's 80 of them, so I'm not going to tell you all of them, but just know the goddess of Hathor, she was sort of the leader, but there are a whole bunch more God had just shown dominion over. Now we're going to look at the final plague in the second cycle. Got it? Right? Okay. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the kiln, let Moses throw it in the air and in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust all over the land of Egypt, and shall cause festering boils on humans and animals throughout the whole land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln, stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it caused festering boils on humans and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils afflicted the magicians as well as all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Now, I don't know if you imagine stuff. I imagine stuff all the time. So I'm imagining, like, they go to Pharaoh's palace, and they have this big bag of soot. You know, what are they doing with the soot? Well, nobody really knows. But they come in with their bag, and they plunk it down in front of Pharaoh, and they reach their hands in the bag, and in front of everyone. Now, if it were you, how do you think you would respond to that? Like, would you go, oh, good, he's doing the soot? All right, well, just think about how you might have felt. This is where culture is so important. In our culture, if you bring a bag of soot into somebody's house and throw it around, that is a way to get in trouble. Okay? But in their day, that was part of their magic to rid the land of pestilence. Ooh. So Pharaoh could have been thinking anything. He might have been thinking, and his magicians, oh, look, they're coming to our side. They're throwing soot in the air just like we do. They're going to put an end to these boils here. Now, this was a terrible parody of their religion. And the soot brought disease instead of ending disease. And I also want you to just think what's been going on in the rest of Egypt. The Hebrews were still making bricks. Now, most of the time, they laid those bricks out in the sun to dry, but they still had brick kilns in Egypt. And I just imagine to myself, Moses and Aaron saying, okay, let's find the nearest brick kiln. We're getting soot from there. Because that soot is a judgment on Pharaoh and all the Egyptians who are enslaving our people, who are still enduring this, in spite of all that's been going on. This is the first time, however, this is the one that I really wanted you to notice. This is the first time God is said to have hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that might feel a little troubling. It did for me. So far, we've had variations on this theme. It's a phrase that shows up after each plague. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Now we have God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Sometimes it says Pharaoh and his officials hardened their own heart. Sometimes it says God hardened Pharaoh and his officials. Actually, this theme occurs over 20 times between Exodus 4 and Exodus 14. And the most troubling aspect of this is that half of these verses talk about God doing the hardening. So I'll tell you what it looks like to me. When I'm hitting this, and I'm just reading it straight up, it looks like God is making Pharaoh resist him and then holding Pharaoh responsible for resisting him. Doesn't it look like that? I mean, that's what it looked like to me. Did God make it impossible for Pharaoh to relent and then find Pharaoh guilty for not relenting and then judge the whole country because of this? I mean, that just sounds awful. And the next question is, if God says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, is he still doing that? Is he still like hardening people and then getting out his big finger and going, guilty? Because it sure feels like that, doesn't it? Yeah. So that was the big question for me this week. And one thing I had to go back to was remembering that what we know about people. Whether we're born this way or whether we grow up this way, the Bible says that people have this tendency towards self-interest, self-absorption. And it's kind of been going on since Adam and Eve, the way Steve talked about. We have this bent. And as you and I go through life, every choice we make either contributes to that bent or a different bent. So it's not like we're static. We're always changing. We're either becoming more like this or more like that. And those choices lay the groundwork for similar choices that form our character. So sometimes it's a long series of choices that set a habit or a character trait. Sometimes it's only one choice. And this is how we know. We see it happen in real life. I read a number of years ago. Do you guys know what the most addictive substance is known to humankind? The most addictive substance of all. Just hazard a guess. Come on. All right. Yeah, I thought so too. Another one. Yeah, I love coffee. Coffee's not addictive. I can stop anytime. Okay. All right. Think of another one. Nicotine. It's nicotine. And did you know that for many people who become addicted to nicotine, it happened with only one long drag on a cigarette? Only one. Their brain chemically resets, and now they're addicted. And you just can't know whether it's a series of choices or one choice that sets the bit inside your head. Nobody knows when that point of no return comes. We can't say, just one more good choice, and this character trait will be mine forever. We can't say that. And we also don't have the ability to predict that I can risk just one more poor choice. I'm just going to have fun one more time, and then I can leave it behind me. None of us knows when that point of no return hits. And sometimes people really do hit that point of no return. We call it addiction. Of your own will, you can't break out of it. Someone's got to help you. Only God knows when that decisive, freedom-destroying choice is going to be made. So now let's take a look at Pharaoh. In this case, Pharaoh initiated the whole process by hardening his own heart or allowing his heart to be hardened again and again. Rather than letting the work of God soften his heart during all those signs and wonders that God displayed, and concluding that, okay, Yahweh really is the only true God. Pharaoh resisted what his eyes were seeing. He even used the data, the evidence, as a basis for actively hardening his heart. He refused to listen to God's word, and God gave him a lot of words. He refused to take God's judgment seriously, which is just fascinating. It was happening right in front of his eyes, but he didn't take it seriously. He refused to change his approach or his ultimate decision. And most of all, this is the one that God called out. Most of all, he refused to be humbled before God. And I think he didn't want to believe because believing meant that God was more powerful than he was. And he was a pretty powerful guy. Believing meant that he would have to bend his knee to a greater authority and a greater power than he had been raised to believe existed. He believed he was the penultimate power in his life. Actually, he believed he was the penultimate power of the whole earth, which, we would say, well, that's kind of arrogant, but he'd been raised to believe that. So it kind of wasn't arrogant. He just knew it was true. But now here was another being saying, but it's not true. Believing would have meant accepting that all he considered was his wasn't actually his. Now, the Bible describes God as all good, never tempting us to evil, and never doing evil. And here's how James put it. You can read it up there. No one, when tempted, should say, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts nobody. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. And then when that desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And that sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved. So here's what we can know. We can know that God did not put a hex on Pharaoh. Still, if God had done nothing, if God had never approached Pharaoh, then this whole power struggle would never have happened either. And God would, Pharaoh wouldn't have been resisting God. So what is happening? Here's what I think is happening. I want you to think of your typical 2-year-old. Okay? And typical 2-year-olds, I watched it with my own eyes. They will eat almost anything if they come up with the idea. I watched my own 2-year-old in a sandbox pick up a cigarette butt. She was going to eat that thing if I hadn't stopped her. Yeah, I know. That's how I felt about it. Just one bite of a cigarette butt. What would that do to you? I didn't want to find out. They're not resolutely set against eating something until you say, you're going to sit here until you eat that. Now your 2-year-old is completely certain she would rather die than ever eat again. Okay? Do any of you guys know 2-year-olds? You know that I'm talking the truth, right? Okay. You've just hardened your 2-year-old's heart. We've all done it. We've all been there. Because here's what happened. What God did was make Pharaoh choose. And he made him choose 10 times. God did not relent. He got into Pharaoh's face 10 times. You must submit. Your only other choice is to rebel. So I come up with a truth out of that. The ability to choose. We like to think of ourselves as free will beings, right? Well, the ability to choose is both a privilege and a responsibility. God calls us to recognize moral values. He, by the way, calls us to recognize him too. And he gives us opportunities, which are also obligations, to make wise, good choices. Each time Pharaoh refused to submit, he became more resolute that he would not let God win. And each time God made Pharaoh choose, you can say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So this 6th plague completes the 2nd cycle. It displays God's dominion over Isis, who's the Egyptian goddess of medicine and peace, but all the other Egyptian gods associated with the earth. And what it leaves us with us today is where might I be having a power struggle with God? He's presented me with opportunities, the privilege, but also the obligation to make a wise, good choice. And daggone it, I just don't want to. I don't know if that describes you. People tell me that I was a strong-willed child. I don't see it, but all right. We're going to get into the 3rd cycle now. And this is where a lot of Bible comes in. So stick with me here. There's some things that I want you to focus on, so I tried to help you. Here it comes. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh. And say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, so that they may worship me. For this time I will send all my plagues upon you yourself, and upon your officials, and upon your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence. You would have been cut off from the earth. But this is why I have let you live, to show you my power, and to make my name resound through all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people, and will not let them go. Did you see that where he says, this is the one that God really keyed in on. You did not humble yourself before me. You still exalt yourself. All right. Tomorrow, at this time, I will cause the heaviest hail to fall that has ever fallen in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Send, therefore, and have your livestock and everything that you have in the open field brought to a secure place. Every human or animal that is in the open field and is not brought under shelter will die when the hail comes down upon them. So look at that. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried their slaves and livestock off to a secure place. That's a third story that's been building underneath this big power struggle. Hang on to that. Those who did not regard the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the open field. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven so that hail may fall on the whole land of Egypt, on humans and animals and all the plants of the field in the land of Egypt. And then Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire came down on the earth. And now, this next slide, you're going to see hail flashing continually, heavy hail that had never ever fallen before on the nation. Hail struck down everything in the open field, human and animal. Hail struck down the plants, shattered the trees. Only in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said to them, this time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord. Enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You need stay no longer. Now, the reason why I didn't highlight that is that just as Bill was talking about last week, he's just negotiating. That's how you negotiate. Like, you become emotional. Dave and I have this little thing that we do where I'm I like it, but I don't know. And Dave is like, I'd love to please her, but, what can you do for me? And that's all a big act, right? It's all a big act. So, did Pharaoh think he'd sinned? I don't think so. Did Pharaoh think the Lord was in the right? Well, how do you find out what people really believe? Yeah, how they live. All right. So that's where we leave Pharaoh. Next slide, Moses said to him, as soon as I have gone out of the city, I will stretch out my hands to the Lord. The thunder will cease. There will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But as for you and your officials, and I think he meant the ones who had left their livestock outside, I know that you do not yet fear the Lord. Now here's this weird little parentheses. It's talking about how the flax and the barley, they hadn't come up yet. So what's Pharaoh thinking? Yeah, well, they got the oats and the beans, but they didn't get the flax and the barley. Hasn't come yet. That was such a freak storm. That'll never happen again. I'm still okay. So Moses left Pharaoh, went out of the city, stretched out his hands to the Lord, and the thunder and the hail ceased, and the rain no longer poured down on the earth. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned once more, hardened his heart, he and his officials. So the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Did you notice who hardened Pharaoh's heart this time? Wasn't God. So here's the things that I really want you to take note of right now. You notice Moses was to meet Pharaoh early in the morning. So several scholars think that Pharaoh was still going down to the Nile to do like his ablutions and stuff. And maybe talk to the Nile god who had been defeated. So I'm not sure what he was going to get out of it. But anyway, this is how each of the cycles begins. It's early in the morning. Next, God alerted Pharaoh that he had reached the point of no return. This time, God would release all his plagues. It was already going to happen. God was going to hold Egypt to account. This is the first time Moses raises his staff. I don't know if you've been keeping track of that. It's the first time Moses raises his staff to heaven. And that was the signal that God was going to now produce this judgment. This is the longest speech that God gave Pharaoh. And it's why this contest was happening. Now, I want you to remember, cast your mind back to when Steve introduced all the plagues and everything. Do you remember that kind of summary? This is why we're doing this thing. He did. It was really good. Okay, so we're going to have a little recap. God's reason for bringing all this hardship on Egypt, because you think about it, This took like the better part of a year. What was God doing? Why would he do this to these? I mean, I don't know if they were nice people or not, but they were just people. Why would he do that? Well, here's why. God says why. Steve pointed out that Pharaoh had said, clear back in chapter 5, that he didn't know any Yahweh. So why was he going to pay attention to Yahweh? And God said, well, okay, I'll show you why. The plagues were designed to reveal God himself, and they teach 4 main lessons. Here we go. First one, knowledge of God as the Lord. Egypt had a wide array of gods. They covered every possible angle, all 80 of them. God was introducing himself as a God that Egypt had never acknowledged. Number 2, knowledge of God as present, especially in the land of Egypt. Now, here's how it went. In the ancient Near East, it was believed that the gods were powerful in their own land. Everybody had their own gods. So Egypt, they had powerful gods that were powerful in Egypt. Okay? Nubia had powerful gods that worked in Nubia. Canaan had powerful gods that worked in Canaan. You see where I'm going with this? And Sumeria and all those places. Okay, so they all had gods, powerful gods, but they only worked within their geographical boundaries. And so what happened was, when nations would clash, it was believed unilaterally that it was the gods clashing. And so whoever won, it wasn't because you had the best army, it's because you had the best God. And so everybody acknowledged it, both the losing side and the winning side acknowledged, okay, your God's the winner. And that God would annex that geographical area, okay, and now that God had more land, and there he would be more powerful. And often they would leave some rulers in the land. They would be vassal kings, and guess what? Their God would be a vassal god. Okay. God was alerting Pharaoh that a God Pharaoh had not acknowledged was not only in the land, but powerful in the land. It's a big deal. Next one. Knowledge of the Lord as without peer. In other words, he is the only God. God was essentially, he was explaining that the whole earth, the entire globe, was his territory, which made all the other gods not only trespassers, but not powerful, because they were on God's own turf. And ultimately, God's intention was to judge all the gods of Egypt. And I was going to show you all the verses where it said that. I just picked one. It's in Exodus 12, so I'm giving you a peeky of what's coming. Exodus 12, God says, it's my intention that I'm going to execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt because I am the Lord. Fourth one, knowledge of God is all powerful. All right, so you're up to speed with Pharaoh thinking he's a god, right? This is his land, his domain. God was now explaining to Pharaoh that he simply was a vassal king. He was a client king. He didn't own anything. He was only there because God had a reason for him being there, and that was the means through which God would reveal himself to the whole world, because he was the God of the whole world. And so this one comes straight out of the Bible. This is another truth, and it's a really good one. There are a bunch of verses that support this one too. It's a lot in Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. And you know, of course, this doesn't mean afraid so much as it means reverent awe. The thing that Pharaoh was missing. God puts a premium on knowing him. This was, in fact, Jesus' chief mission while he was alive, was to make God known. And his chief mission in death was to reconcile people with God so that we could know God at the very deepest level. And so I have to ask myself, in what fresh ways is God revealing himself to me? Do I think I know God as deep as I can? I'm pretty sure I don't. So he is seeking for me to know him more deeply. Is he doing that with you? And if he is, then where do you think he wants you to know him more deeply? And what would happen if you asked him, God, how do you want me to know you more deeply? Where do I not know you as well as I could? What do you think would happen in your life if you ask that question. It's kind of a scary question. So far, God has proven his dominion over much of Egypt's gods, and we have enough information now to build a picture of the pattern God set for these plagues, these cycles of plagues. And that is a slide I tucked in there. See all those gods so far? They represent all the different areas. You can see cycle 3, that one there begins with Nut. And then those other 2 are going to get covered next week. So we're just starting with cycle 2. All right, so there's going to be a chart that shows up now. And you're going to see 3 columns. That represents the 3 cycles. You see that's the Nile, the earth, the sky. And if you go back and look at your Bible yourself, you'll see how each of these things lines up with that. The Nile's water, frogs, gnats, all have to do with living around and near and in water. Then the next column has flies and livestock, and people for the first time are personally affected. Those are all creatures of the earth. And the plants of the earth are destroyed. And then the last column is hail coming right out of the sky, thunder, lightning, and so on. And then I won't tell you any more about what's going to happen with that. Just keep it in mind that it's all going to have to do with the sky. And then you can read on down all the ways that the pattern is set. Starts early in the morning by the Nile with Pharaoh, then moves into Pharaoh's palace, kind of in his face. And the third one comes without warning each time in the cycle. God just does it. If you look at each of those columns, you'll also see where God is setting forth his purpose, which is to know him. You also notice that each column shows more and more pressure on Pharaoh and on the people. C.S. Lewis called it God's megaphone of pain. Have you guys ever heard that saying? Yeah. When you're deaf, God uses pain to sort of rouse you out of your stupor. God showed his dominion in stages as well. Remember the first cycle. Do you remember what the magicians called Aaron's staff? What they thought it was, because their staffs weren't very powerful. They called it the finger of God. Remember that? It's the finger of God. That's what's happening. And then Moses comes in and he corrects that. He says, no, it's the hand of God. You're going to see the hand of God at work. We're not going to even be part of it at all. He's just going to do it all. And he did. God reveals his hand. And then the last one, God comes out with his word. We think of God's hand as the most powerful, but I think God is saying, my word's the most powerful. I think we found that out with Jesus, didn't we? All right, so you see a progression all there. And here's the thing that I just love, that I want you to see, that Moses is emerging with each obedient step of faith as a strong man of God. Remember how he started out? And he's getting more and more confident in God's call, confident in God's power, confident in God's ability. He's even speaking a lot more words. I mean, that was quite a speech for Moses, the end of that chapter. He's the conduit for God's mighty acts. And each time Moses made a wise and good choice, he was laying the groundwork to make another wise and good choice, listening to God and living that out, acting on it, taking those steps of faith. And so that brings up a great truth. Every wise choice strengthens us to make another wise choice. And, what choices are you facing right now? I mean, we all are facing some choices. And so if you're sensing that God's presenting the same kind of choices to you, which you can tell because you say, gosh, this situation feels familiar. I feel like I've done this already. If you're feeling that, it might be that God is presenting you the opportunity to make a wise and good choice, lay some groundwork for some more choices down the road, which will take more faith and more wisdom. Now, the underneath story was noticing that some of these Egyptian officials were really starting to fear the Lord. And what did they do? They made a wise and good choice, right? They made a wise and good choice, which laid the groundwork for more wise and good choices. Just hang on to that. Might show up again later on down in the story. So I'm going to leave you with that. I think we have time to sing a song. And then I have one more slide for after we sing. So hopefully a last slide will come up And the thing that really came to me this week is that the ability to choose really is a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. So how do I make good and wise choices? What is my guide? And my guide is the fear of the Lord, the reverent fear and love of the Lord. And that knowledge of him, that deep relationship with him, is what's going to give me insight. And so let's pray. Oh Lord, soften our hearts. Help us to accept what you're showing us in your word and in our lives. Help us to listen more and listen better. Make us able to learn what it is that you're showing us and telling us. Help us to lean into the ways that you're changing us and maturing us. And oh God, please help us know when it's really on our end, we're refusing to be humbled before you. Help us to know you more. Show us where we need that. Strengthen us to live wisely for your sake and for the sake of the people you love so much, and even for our own sake. Amen.